Hello and welcome to another episode of BFRR, our Bitcoin, Fiat and Rock and Roll podcast that explores the intersection of traditional finance, digital assets and digital currencies and helps you to understand how digital money and assets will evolve in the future. And today we have a very interesting guest in this podcast, Maha El Dimachki, the new CEO of GFTN Solutions. Hello, Maha.
Hello, Manuel. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us in the podcast. And there's a background to you joining the podcast because we are very happy to engage in a partnership with GFTN and the Point Zero Forum in Zurich. It is an amazing conference taking place in Zurich soon, and we will hear also a jingle in the midst of this episode. Our listeners will be able to get a little discount for the tickets as well, and we will appear also as a media partner. So we are very happy to engage in this partnership and have you on this podcast and basically go through all of your different projects that you've been working on, because you have done so. You've had an impressive career spanning across the private sector and the public sector at the regulator as well, and then ran the BIS Innovation Hub Center in Singapore for quite a while. And you've been engaging with your team in a couple of very interesting projects. So we're going to go through those projects. So we discussed in the beginning as well, as per the title of this podcast, Bitcoin, Fiat and Rock and Roll. We're going to focus on Fiat and rock and roll predominantly today. Fiat in the sense that there's obviously lots of developments in making the existing systems and also building new systems and making it more efficiently. So we're going to dive deeper into those projects and then end up with an overview of GFTN Solutions, where you are the CEO. So I'm very much looking forward to that episode. And before we dive deeper into the episode, Maha, maybe you can quickly give our audience a quick rundown who you are and how your professional career has developed over the last years and decades. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Manuel. We're excited by the partnership, by the way. And, rock and roll, I think, is what sold it for me to come and talk to you. It's my favorite genre of music, I must add. So that's part of who I am. But in terms of my career in financial services, well, I would say I'm an accidental resident of financial services. It was one of those things that I came into at a very young age. I loved it and I stayed, and I'm still here, 25 plus years on. So starting off within sort of retail banking and then moving into payments. And I think payments is really where there was a lot of excitement. And back then, actually, payments wasn't the exciting conversation. It was more the boring back-end conversation. And I kept telling people, this is where the excitement happens. This fuels the economy. And no one believed me. And, 20 years on, when everybody started talking about payments, I said, I told you so 20 years ago. I said this. But that kind of really anchored, if you like, my career and my work in payments. And then kind of moving beyond just payments itself into all different verticals of payments, from cards. I started in merchant acquirings, but cards, account-to-account payments, from a retail level all the way through to corporate institutions. So I kind of got to experience the various verticals, the various sectors, and the various types of disciplines around, strategy, product, operations, sales, etc. And then you move into sort of working capital services and looking at sort of payments more broadly within the working capital space and within corporate banking. And interestingly, I always felt like I wanted a career that takes me around the world. And this career took me around the world. So I got to see global payments, global corporate banking, and moved country as a result. Now, as far as innovation is concerned, when we think about innovation and the first wave of innovation and now where we are today, payments seems to be at the heart of all of this, right? And that's really what kind of got me more into the innovation space, is the fact that innovators, started off with innovating in payments, and then that started to expand across other financial services. So that brought me from private sector going into public sector, and I set up the first payments department at the FCA, into the payment system operator, Pay.UK, where I was on secondment for a year. Then I set up another department at the FCA that would oversee early and high growth firms, so startups and scale-ups. And then, as you mentioned, the BIS Innovation Hub, working with central banks on innovating within the central banking community. And of course, now my role at GFTN, which is really about kind of building innovation ecosystems in financial services around the world. So very exciting journey. I didn't necessarily plan it. I didn't wake up one day when I was 7 years old and said, you know what, I want to do this in my life. I just followed the path and here I am.
Yeah, it's impressive. And you said as well, and I fully agree. Back in the day, even though I was not even working in payments was not the sexy area where lots of developments and lots of innovation happened. But then I saw that at the FCA, for example, you were also working on PSD2, which is open banking, right? Which was already leading to lots of innovation here where other third-party service providers like payment initiation service providers, account service providers can interact with open banking interfaces and provide additional services. I think that was at the heart of that, a role that you had. And then Pay UK is the provider of the payment systems in the UK, so ACH and faster payments, where there was also lots of development. So you really were able, if I follow your career correctly, to already work on these developments, but then also focus even more on more innovation, for example, in the BIS Innovation Hub in Singapore. Singapore is a very active hub there as well, right, where lots of innovation took place. So really coming from the regulatory induced innovation into even more disruptive innovation with interesting projects there. Yeah.
Now, that's a great way to frame it. The regulatory induced innovation to sort of market disruption, market disruptive innovation. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and jumping to the BIS, which is going to be a major topic of this podcast as well, basically the projects that you've been working on there. Can you explain our listeners, and many of our listeners already know what the BIS is, but give us a little overview of what the BIS is and does, and also what these innovation hubs around the world are doing, were doing, because you're not there anymore, right? Or what you were doing there, and what in general the idea is of these innovation hubs to spur innovation that is not regulatory induced.
Yeah, well, I mean, I had a great time at the BIS, and if I were to describe it, it's the central bank of central banks. Most people know the BIS for perhaps the Basel Committee into banking and supervision. At its heart, the BIS is a platform for collaboration on dialogue around global monetary policy and financial stability. And the Innovation Hub was then set up to, knowing that these disruptive technologies, and I use disruptive not in a negative sense, you take it literally, but knowing these disruptive technologies are becoming pervasive, and how can central banks actually respond to that? Think about what that means for the markets and for the economy, but be able to experiment in a safe environment. And that's where the Innovation Hub was set up, to partner with various central banks to be able to conduct these experiments, proof of concepts, prototypes, various research projects and so on. And really it's centered on the role of the central bank. How can they understand these technologies more, and how might some of these technologies actually further their ability to discharge their duties? How can we create public goods through the Innovation Hub and through these experiments? And the idea was that it is very much exactly that, experimental, but it was needed. It became quite a popular sort of function. And I think it was a great bold move from the BIS, and certainly our central banking partners really responded to it.
And the BIS Innovation Hub centers around the world were coming up, and I was going to check when that actually was, but they were coming up, I feel, also in light of this whole blockchain innovation, right? And the DLT innovation that might lead to new ways of how money is being moved. Stablecoins slowly came up, then decentralized finance protocols came up. And I think this is also what the BIS Innovation Hub centers have looked into, right? Would you agree that this was very much tied and linked also to the upcoming new potentially revolutionary technology that might have quite a big of an impact on the traditional financial world?
Absolutely. I think if you look at the early experiments of the hub, it really was around CBDCs, tokenizing central bank money, looking at blockchain technologies. There were a number of different themes, very important themes. CBDCs was one of them, or maybe more broadly tokenization, I would say, and what that technology offers. They also looked at, open finance as a theme, cybersecurity, always important. AI, obviously, and particularly AI in subtech and regtech, in supervisory technology. The themes were very much around the technologies that were coming through. Green finance, for example, was another theme, and they're the 5 themes. But it was what was really coming through as experimentation was needed in this space. And quite a lot of the early experiments were on CBDCs and on tokenization. There was a healthy amount of projects also on the other themes, but then you start to see a little bit of a shift from tokenization through to now AI, and AI being quite pervasive. And what does that mean from agentic AI, or generative AI, I should say, through to agentic now. And so that's now also dominating. So you could see the evolution, and the agility of the hub was important from that perspective, as the conversation is shifting and changing. I mean, there were experiments even on quantum and quantum proofing the financial system, quantum proofing payment systems were some of the projects that were also looked at. So it responded to what was a really necessary conversation because it's becoming more prevalent, but it also looked at early stage experimentation, such as the quantum work, and it kept sort of current and really looked at the role of central banks and how they can aid the role of central banks with experimenting with these new technologies. And some of these technologies, or some of these experiments, I should say, have then gone on to the next phase and the next phase. Whether it's kind of, taking the first experiment to the next stage experimentation, or whether some of it potentially might actually go into, central banks might want to use it within their own systems, or there might be projects that have gone out to live implementation in the market.
And I just looked it up again. So the BIS established 3 centers in Switzerland, Hong Kong, and Singapore back in 2019, and then they got operational in 2019 and 2020. So Singapore was already at the forefront, at the heart of this whole development. And you then joined the Singapore Innovation Center as a lead, you can say, right? In October 2023 up until February 2026, focusing next to, I think, also green finance predominantly on 3 projects, if I'm not mistaken, which is Project Nexus, Mandala, and Rialto. And we're going to go through them. They all focus on cross-border payment innovation. I mean, back as we discussed, your focus has also been payments. Here, cross-border payments to make cross-border payments more efficiently. So let's maybe start with Nexus, because this was also the first project that was reported back, I think, already in 2022 and 2023, but then with the final report back in July 2024. Can you run us through what Project Nexus is and how it differs to the way how currently cross-border payments are being done?
Absolutely. So, the motivation for Nexus is that, you have instant payment systems that have been being set up on a domestic level around the world. And it's one of these really successful infrastructures, actually, that have been set up around the world. They've achieved so much in terms of financial inclusion, the benefits of sort of to the economy in terms of economic activity, SMEs being able to manage their cash flows better. So a number of benefits that instant payment systems offer on a domestic level. And we started to see the idea of interlinking instant payment systems on a cross-border level, taking advantage of the infrastructure that's already there. How can we then move from instant payment systems domestically to cross-border instant payments? And so there were some experiments, and it really came with the backdrop of the G20 target roadmap for, cross-border payments. How can we look at ideas in which we can improve on those targets, and particularly cost, speed, access, and transparency? And so the bilateral kind of linking instant payment systems between 2 countries countries in Asia in particular, started to experiment with that. And it showed benefit. The idea of Nexus is that you have a hub, and rather than bilateral linkages happening all around the world, you can have one hub, and everybody who connects into the hub can then connect to all the other partners that have that connection. And that's the whole idea of what Nexus can do. We experimented with, the initial prototype was 3 countries. It proved that it's technically feasible to do this. But then the hard work was when we needed to look at what does it mean from a technical standpoint to develop a production-ready blueprint to deliver this into the real world. And so the technical analysis needed to be done, the regulatory and legal analysis needed to be done, the scheme, the rules around it, etc. And of course, the commercial viability of this. And that's always an important component to any new project. So the idea of interlinking instant payment systems as another way in which cross-border payments can be effected is to respond to the G20 targets, or the G20 ambition of reducing cost, improving speed, etc. So it's another channel for cross-border payments to look at how we might improve on how cross-border payments work today. The initial use case was remittance payments, and those who are sending money home, migrant workers, etc. That was one of the initial use cases. And often what you find is that the cost of a cross-border payment for them is quite high. And so looking at how can you leverage the infrastructure that's already there and allow for the foreign exchange sort of to happen as part of that kind of ecosystem, we tested whether that actually can improve the cost and speed. And it showed that it can. And as a result of that work, it ended up going into implementation. So now there's an entity that's been set up. They're looking to implement it into the real world. 5 central banks are part of this. If I'm not mistaken, there might be 6 now. And so the blueprint that we built actually was something that was then taken into real world production. And this is where BIS at the time handed that over to the new entity to establish. BIS doesn't own and operate these sorts of structures, but the technology got to a point where it then can be handed over.
Yeah, and I think this is a great example of how innovation work being facilitated by the innovation hubs of the BIS can lead to real adoption, or let's say to a real project which is currently now being built by the new entity that has been founded, I think, last year, and which is now really working on exactly that multilateral interlinkage of the connected instant payment systems. Now, to summarize again from my view, what I find so interesting about this project is when you think about how correspondent banking at the moment works, it's basically a sequential process of multiple banks that hold nostro accounts with each other. There's usually, deducts where the money that is being sent doesn't necessarily end up in the same notional at the end. It might include additional costs. It might take a little longer. And here now connecting instant payment systems with an SLA that is, I think, under a minute can, first of all, create lots of speed and then also ensure that full principal is being sent, meaning there's no deducts, right? And ultimately allows, as you said, the usage of existing infrastructure where mostly in most countries, all banks are already connected to, given that there is local domestic regulation to enable cross-border payments more efficiently. So I think that is a very exciting topic, and or project, and as you say, it's more scalable in a multilateral way than building individual bilateral linkages, right? Which already exist in Asia, as you say, in the APAC region. But the idea is, right, if I understand it correctly, really to bring it global. I think the ECB is also talking to Nexus to connect their TIPS platform to allow really this global connectivity, right?
Yeah. And actually, you make a great point, and it's important to make this distinction. I think, correspondent banking often cops a little bit of a bad reputation, but actually quite a lot of correspondent banking tends to work. It works well, and it covers the vast majority of actual payments. So often, the reason for the delay or, for speed and cost, these are difficult topics that need to be unlocked. So correspondent banking has come a long way. And I should say that for what Nexus does today, it does rely on the concept of correspondent banking in the background. It does rely on the concept of having, FX providers. Your senders and receiving banks have accounts with the FX providers. They could be the account holders themselves or they have partners. And it allows for that foreign currency clearing and settlement to happen in the background. The concept of correspondent banking is actually embedded into Nexus. Where there's still that friction, it is something that we need to, as a community, try to look at how we solve. And this is actually why we've broken up, if you like, Nexus is doing one particular thing in terms of using that instant payment infrastructure to connect and do it on a multilateral basis. But then you still have frictions in cross-border payments that Nexus doesn't solve yet, right? And if we solve them, actually we solve them for Nexus and we solve them for all sorts of cross-border payments. And these are things like compliance processes. It is the clearing and settlement of foreign exchange. Those sorts of things, absent of Nexus, need to be considered anyway. And the approach we took at the Innovation Hub is, I keep saying, if you're going to do everything, you end up doing nothing. So you have to take it one step at a time and look at the various components that you want to innovate within. And as long as the innovation and the way you approach it is in a modular fashion, you can then start to build that, bring those building blocks together. And that's what will create the future financial market infrastructure. that you really want, where you really unlock the benefits and, the G20 targets can be, advanced further and achieved.
Yeah, and that's actually a perfect bridge also to the other two projects that you also then worked on, to some extent also in parallel, is my understanding, which is Mandala and Rialto, which is the compliance aspect and the FX aspect, right? Because of course, even though you might use new rails to move the funds around the world using interlinked instant payment systems, you still, as a bank or as a financial institution, obviously have to ensure regulatory compliance and do sanction checks, for example, where at the moment all those checks are done by all the involved participants and therefore duplicating, so to say, the checks, right? And I think this is exactly where Mandala tried to think about alternatives to provide a more holistic joint compliance check setup. Can you give us a little overview of what the idea of Mandala is or was, and what has come out of this project, and what the benefits of, for example, also using new technology here could be?
Yeah, it's a great example of where, Nexus is building on existing technology in the fiat world, right? And Mandala is trying to use new technologies, peer-to-peer technology, to solve one of the friction points in cross-border payments. And the new technologies complementing, coming together with existing technologies is a really important thing to think about. How do we replace financial, is it substitution? Is it complementing what we have today? How do we move from what we have today to what the future might look like? And so this complementing what we have today with new technologies and new ideas is the concept behind Mandala. Mandala is also a modular. It could work with blockchain infrastructure and it could work in the traditional finance world. So the idea behind Mandala is that you have a peer-to-peer sort of technology where the compliance requirements for a particular cross-border transaction are embedded in a protocol layer. Then every time a payment is initiated, the idea is that you can check against, the compliance requirements, what is required for that particular transaction. So there's certainty around the requirements, the compliance requirements. It can also do the compliance for you and create a verifiable proof that can then be attached to the transaction, and it can travel along the chain of the transaction from the initiator all the way through to the recipient. And the way in which the validation of the compliance happens and the generation of the proof is using privacy-preserving technologies. So if there's any sensitive information, that can also be respected and protected. And it allows then for, rather than going through a process of harmonizing compliance requirements all around the world, which is a very tall order and a really difficult ambition to achieve, it looks at respecting the compliance requirements and regulatory and legal laws in various countries, but trying to automate that process and making it sort of real time with the transaction and front loading it. So, conducting the transaction ex ante rather than ex post. And that hopefully means that once the transaction actually leaves its origin to its destination, there's no more friction in terms of compliance across the chain. When I was at the BIS, we did the first phase of Mandala. It showed a lot of promise. We had various use cases on sanction screening, capital flow management measures. And now the team are actually, from what I understand, are going through the second phase, which they're expanding on that work. So a lot of promise with Mandala and a lot of interest in what it potentially can achieve.
And therefore reducing, as said in the beginning, also the number of checks that eventually have to be done. I don't think the banks have to rely on the checks that have already been done by other banks. But nevertheless, you can ensure with privacy-preserving technology, if I understand it correctly, that you have done certain checks. For example, checking on global lists before then you as another institution in the processing chain have to do the same checks again, right? And therefore reducing the amount of work, reducing the amount of checks that obviously take time or can also lead to false positive hits and so forth. You say now the team might work on a second stage of the project. So this project is not as far developed, if I understand it correctly, as Nexus, in the sense that it is not being put into force at different projects. So was rather a research project and showcasing how it could look like by using new technology to make this process more efficiently, right?
Absolutely. I think like everything, you start with the technology, but there's a whole raft of questions that kind of then gets overlaid, and it necessarily has to go through phases.
Great, yeah. And then the third project, to sum it up, was Rialto, basically focusing on the FX part, right? Where we already went through the example of Nexus, where FX is obviously also still required. There's an FX provider, as you said, that basically receives one currency and then pays out the other, both connected via the instant payment systems, domestic instant payment systems. So how does Rialto, in an example of Nexus, for example, could be plugged into the FX part, and what's the overall idea and ambition of the project Rialto?
Well, I mean, I mentioned the other friction point around cross-border payments in some kind of corridors more than others, but is the FX clearing and settlement. It could be expensive, it takes time and so on. And so Rialto came in to really look at how might we consider FX clearing and settlement in tokenized form. So tokenizing FX and the settlement happening in central bank money, so as a safe settlement asset, but linking that to a structure like Nexus, linking it to a structure that has instant payment systems connecting to each other. So that was the ambition and the motivation behind Rialto, kind of where we looked at Nexus and we said the two friction points are kind of compliance and FX clearing and settlement, and Mandala and Rialto were the experiments that looked at, in isolation, but again, in a modular fashion, what might the technology offer us to actually solve for those friction points. And so the flexibility potentially of Rialto is that, it can be, Rialto is the Rialto Bridge, right? It connects two parts of the bank, but it's also, the Rialto Bridge in Italy is a marketplace. And so that's the motivation or the inspiration behind the name. So it can connect into any kind of cross-border payment structure and allow for that sort of clearing and settlement in tokenized FX and having central bank money as the safe settlement asset as sort of back in the background.
And using tokenized versions of the central bank money, so CBDCs, wholesale CBDCs, you could call them, or tokenized reserves, or however you want to call them. I think what you also used here is DeFi influenced or infused mechanism, an automated market-making mechanism, right, where the banks would provide liquidity in a liquidity pool in central bank money, and not in stable currency in this case, as we know from the DeFi world, but rather in central bank money, where then, as part of this AMM, automated market-making protocol, the exchange is automatically done based on the bonding curve of those two currencies. And that would affect, obviously, also the way how the FX is being processed by banks. It's a completely new way. Where would you see this form of FX when it comes to adoption in the market? Was this more than on the further part of the research time angle, you could argue?
It's experimental. It was still experimental. It took inspiration from an earlier project that we did, Project Mariana. And fun fact on Project Mariana: Mariana Trenches, the deepest point on Earth, and we actually realized that we need really deep liquidity pools for Project Mariana. And so we looked at how might we use these insights, how might we use these learnings. And this is the great thing about innovation and experiments and the outcome is always a learning, and the learning in and of itself is value. And so we took those learnings and looked at how might we look at structuring Rialto and what might be some of the structure of the AMMs or other ways in which we might solve for this. But it continued to be experimental. But even the settlement in central bank money, tokenized CBDCs or tokenized central bank money, you can have other types of ways in which settlement can happen. It can settle in RTGS with synchronization. Another one of the projects out of the London Centre is Project Meridian FX. So, there's different ways. It's really about offering insights into what is the art of the possible and where is the flexibility to design things that can solve the problem. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a complete overhaul of the system. Or it can be, but it's the choices that we have. And various countries have these choices to make. And the idea of the hub is that always putting out these learnings to offer more insights and more choices. So it's not as further advanced, I would say, with Rialto as what Nexus is. And keep in mind that Nexus was based on infrastructure that's been tried and tested and people trusted. All the frameworks around it it really relied on existing frameworks. And that's potentially the reason it was able to advance a lot further than some of the others. Mandala and Rialto were more experimental.
Yeah, and if you had to prioritize now after those three projects, solving compliance or building new rails and building connectivity or FX, which one would unlock the most value globally from your perspective, and why would that be?
That's an unfair question, and I'm probably going to upset somebody, no matter what my answer is. But I mean, I feel like compliance is something that really needs to, we really need to tackle how we can reduce the compliance burden whilst holding high standards. This is not about a race at the bottom or trying to reduce the compliance standards. In fact, if we can find ways in which we can make it much more efficient, then we can hold high standards but still make it efficient. So that to me is maybe it's because I'm passionate about wanting to hold high standards, given that I've come from private sector into regulation, but still use technologies to try and find a way to do it efficiently.
Before we jump back into today's episode, we'd like to tell you about the Point Zero Forum, an annual gathering of over 2,000 policymakers, central bankers, regulators, and industry leaders at the intersection of finance, technology, and policy. Organized by the Global Finance and Technology Network, the GFTN, and the Swiss State Secretary of Finance, Point Zero Forum will take place in Zurich on the 23rd to 25th of June this year. This year's lineup includes Swiss Federal Counsellor Karin Keller-Sutter, Tether CEO Paolo Ardoino, former crypto head of policy at Andreessen Horowitz Brian Quintens, and NVIDIA's EMEA financial technology lead Dr. Jochen Papenbroek. Point Zero will cover everything from AI and financial services and digital assets to stablecoins, tokenization, and the new regulatory frontier where the rules of finance are being rewritten. Register at pointzeroforum.com. We include the link in the show notes. BFRR listeners get a 30% discount of the full price for the industry pass with the code BFRR 2026. So everything in capital letters, BFRR 2026. You'll find everything in the show notes, and now enjoy the rest of the episode. Yeah, and I mean, you don't have to go so far into experimental projects, I would say, when it comes to solving compliance, but rather on the shorter term, even introducing ISO 20022 and structured addresses can already help a lot, right? To reduce the false positives, even though you still have, sequential processing in correspondent banking or even in interlinked instant payment systems where every participant in the value chain does the same checks on the lists that they want to adhere to. But yeah, increasing the data quality, I think, already can help here. And then, yeah, you then left the BIS Innovation Hub this year in February, so relatively short while ago, and then became the CEO of GFTN Solutions. Do those projects of the BIS Innovation Hub still play a role in your new role as CEO of GFTN Solutions before we then dive deeper into GFTN Solutions?
Well, I mean, look, the role of the BIS and what the Innovation Hub has done has certainly been sort of an inspiration for me in terms of what potentially can then be taken into real world application. And that possibly was the key motivation for me to come to GFTN, is because then you can take some of these, what were experiments, they're moving down the kind of the maturity path to where we can now start to implement in the real world. GFTN can then, Solutions in particular offers me the opportunity to do that real implementation, partnering with various central banks, governments around the world to actually implement this stuff. So it's a natural progression from the experimentation, but then moving to actual live implementation. So I'm always inspired by what the BIS has done. I had a fantastic time there and have made a lot of friends. And I think the work that the BIS does at any rate is a lot of people in financial services look to that, whether it's on the research piece or the innovation hub piece. So I take inspiration, absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, GFTN, we're going to dive deeper now into what that is, but it's also not that far away, at least to my understanding, from the BIS Innovation Hub, because those are actually sponsored by the domestic central banks, right? Here in this case, the MAS as well, and GFTN has also been created and founded by the MAS back in 2024. I mean, it used to be Elevandi, which was very much known for the flagship conferences, predominantly, right? Insights Forum, Singapore FinTech Festival, Point Zero Forum as well. So can you run us through what GFTN is and what it does, and what GFTN Solutions actually also does and is?
You mentioned the kind of where we came from. It was Elevandi. The Singapore FinTech Festival is probably the most popular, I would say, brand that a lot of people know. And it really started from that forum's perspective. But looking at all the insights that we capture through the forums, there's quite a lot of dialogue. There's quite a lot of interesting conversations across multiple layers and levels of the ecosystem, as well as across multiple sectors within financial services and the various players, from regulators to industry, commercial entities to academia. And so a lot of that content, that information, those insights are all captured. And so we kind of sit at a wealth of information in terms of what are the priorities in the global markets, what's the word on the street? And solutions now comes in to really turn some of these insights into action. How can we look at building on what is happening all around the world along these new technologies to try to look at ways in which we can then move to implementation, whether it's creating pathways to implementation, playbooks that are helpful to really to move from the insights into implementation. The solutions business in particular focuses on building effective, resilient innovation ecosystems for countries. And the way we do this is across three key pillars. The first is very important: policy development, strategic policy development, analysis, readiness. Where are you today on a particular sort of policy question? And what is the delta? Where do you need to be? And how might you then implement that policy change? And the how you might implement that policy change isn't just about policy writing. It's about public-private partnerships, particularly in today's world of kind of regulation and policy making. And the engagement with the industry is very important. So we use our platforms to do that, whether it's digital platforms or different types of platforms of collaboration. It could be sandboxes, it could be test beds, it could be, setting up innovation hubs to then, either experiment to inform policy change or to deliver various outcomes as a result of the policy change. And then the third, which I think is very important, is what we call capacity building. Capacity building is exactly that. It's upskilling on an institutional level, so regulators, even commercial entities, sort of understand what it means to them to respond to some of these disruptive technologies. But it's also upskilling for talent pipeline, for entrepreneurship and innovation kind of pipeline coming through. So depending on what the central bank or maybe the particular jurisdiction is interested in, using those three pillars, we could sort of frame a program that really delivers on the ground. And the delivery, the orchestration of the delivery is really what we pride ourselves on. It's kind of making sure that we're there on the ground, side by side, looking at how we can, deliver incremental value across the program with some strong KPIs that we hold ourselves to account. So that's what the solutions business does, but it's very complementary to how GFTN was born. The idea is that, I spoke about public sector and the work that we do there, but certainly even with private sector, sort of how they're looking, the engagement between public and private sector and that intersection is just really important these days. And with these new technologies that are not only economy-wide, they're cross-regulator and everybody has a role to play, that public-private partnership is very important.
So as part of the capacity building pillar, the third pillar that you described, I think there's an interesting project that has been announced or that you've been working on, which is the capacity building project in India. Can you run us through very quickly an overview of what you've basically reached there, what the outcome of the work that you've been doing there has been?
Yeah, so I think that's one of our flagship projects in India, in the state of Odisha. And the idea is really working with them on a 5-year plan to set up sort of a financial innovation center in the state. And I mentioned the three pillars, but specifically, the importance of capacity building is illustrated in that particular example where we run capacity building program for talent development. And the first cohort, it's a 5-month program, and the first cohort had 300 students enroll, 195 graduated, and 70 found jobs. And so the along with the capacity building is sort of the job fairs and the matching, and that impact on the ground is really what we try to focus on. So it's I've only been here 2 months, but it's a statistic that really kind of has stuck with me in terms of the importance of how these three pillars come together, and specifically important for the importance of capacity building in this case.
Yeah, great example. Yeah, and you said that you work with central banks, but also governments. So is it fair to summarize that this is the key area that you focus on, or the key client segment that you are focused on, being sponsored, so to say, by the MAS, also then helping other central banks to go through regulation, to go through, the innovation, as you said. So really working together with the policymakers on realizing new policy, more efficient policy and innovation around the world.
Yeah, that's right. I think our pedigree is very much public sector, but again, we all have private sector experience. So the intersection of public and private sector, it's a really important sort of point at which, in today's environment, with the technologies that are coming down the line with the disruption, I think the need for public-private partnerships and the ability for all parties in the ecosystem to engage in a collaborative way is really important. So again, from the point of view, and when we talk about developing ecosystems, it's also the corridors, the trade corridors. So this is where the private sector comes in terms of looking at those investment opportunities, looking at the talent that they need. So we open up those corridors and allow for hopefully a better outcome for both commercial entities and private sector, as well as the markets in question.
Yeah, and this is also, your background, as you said, right? So working on both worlds, GFTN really sits between the regulators and the industry. So maybe as a summary, what have you learned about making these two worlds collaborate more effectively? Because this is ultimately then also, I think, the heart of what GFTN Solutions can bring, right?
Yeah, look, I think having sat in both worlds, you're right. I think there's certain dynamics, I think, in both worlds that perhaps lend itself to how there might be at least perceived breakdown in kind of the role of both and the communication between both. And what I've observed actually is, if you really think about it, you've got the commercial entities that are entrepreneurial, they're innovative, they're market driven, they're bullish and ambitious on one hand, and then you have the regulator, which is necessarily a risk manager. And so when they look at any particular sort of theme, activity, dynamic, they're looking at it from different perspectives. And I find that sometimes it's the language breakdown that actually creates that misunderstanding. And I've experienced it myself, because I was in industry and I went into the regulator, and I think they were quite scared by how I approach things, even though the outcome that we want to achieve is the same. We all want strong markets. We want to operate in strong markets with certainty, with strong institutions, with, the ability for confidence, for consumers to consume and investors to invest. We all want that same outcome. But sometimes that breakdown in communication and in how we approach it might be something for us to think about. Which leads me to the next point. I think there's a lot of talk around how regulators need to understand new technologies to be able to really develop policy change that is proportionate and it's appropriate and and forward-looking. And I agree with that, absolutely. But on the other hand, I also feel that there's an onus on industry to also understand the role of regulation and why it's there. And some, absolutely do that and they understand that. But there's more to be done there, particularly with maybe smaller organizations. What is the role of regulation? What does it mean to actually be a regulated entity? And how might they play their role proactively in that? And those things coming together, I think, is what really then delivers that a strong market, a strong, resilient, well-regulated, better regulation, proportionate regulation that allows for better outcomes all round.
Very interesting. Yeah, definitely interesting to see the change from, as you perfectly described, from the connections from the conference and forum world, where lots of insights were being generated, now into more bringing those insights into the world, and then also leveraging potentially investments into this new world. So very interesting overview, and I think we can slowly also come to an end of this interesting podcast session here with you, Maha. If you forwarded, let's say, 5 years to the future, where would you see GFTN Solutions predominantly now as a success, or what would success look for you like when you think about GFTN Solutions?
Well, I'd like to think that we have contributed to impact in the world. A lot of our work at the moment is in low and middle income countries. I'd like to think that, by then and impact is very important as a principle of what we do as an organization. And so I'd like to see that we have contributed to real impact in the world through the work that we do. I must acknowledge, together with many other organizations that also want to and do deliver impact, there's so much to do. So if we can make a good contribution in this space, I'll be happy.
Yeah, and GFTN in general also continuing to provide all these flagship events. We are very much looking forward to the Point Zero Forum, which is really a high-profile event with lots of central bankers, senior bankers, regulators, politicians coming together, discussing new trends in the industry. So we are very happy to participate there and also continue to follow the discussions there. And then we'll also clearly follow the developments of GFTN going forward. Maya, was a pleasure to talk to you and get all these insights, especially also into the concrete projects that you and the BIS Innovation Hub has been working on. And lots of success for you for GFTN Solutions, obviously. We would love to have you back maybe in some time to revisit on where GFTN has developed into, or what it has developed into, and where GFTN Solutions stands. So thanks a lot for all your valuable contributions.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and dear listeners, I hope that was an interesting discussion as always, that you learned also what the BIS Innovation Hub in Singapore predominantly focused on over the last years under Maha's leadership. If you liked the content, make sure obviously to spread the word about the podcast and follow us on all the channels where we are present. So thanks a lot for tuning in, and see and hear you next time. Bye-bye.
The views expressed are solely the personal opinions of the hosts and are provided for informational purposes only. This podcast does not offer financial or investment advice. Always conduct your own research and make well-informed decisions before investing. Please be aware that the hosts and guests may hold cryptocurrencies or digital assets discussed in this episode.